Hello and welcome back to Advanced Java. In this video, I'm going to introduce the concepts of reading files and exception handling. So I'll be working off of the lecture notes or the demo notes on the course website for this portion. And then I'm going to come back and put together a working demo that you can kind of code along with me so that you've got a working example of reading and exception handling. And these really are two pretty big topics that we're combining into one discussion here. And you're going to see that these are really closely tied together. So exception handling means dealing with something when it goes wrong in terms of our code. And if you think about reading a file, there's an awful lot that can go wrong there. I could have the wrong file name and therefore that file doesn't exist. Maybe I don't have permissions to that file and I'm not able to open it, okay? Or I'm not able to write to that file, and we'll talk about writing in a separate video. But there's just kind of a lot that can happen. Or maybe my connection to wherever that file is kind of goes bad in the middle of reading that file. So that's kind of another thing that can happen. So exception handling is going to tie right into that because we need to handle those scenarios and be prepared for those. So let's go ahead and start off again. I'm going to talk just about reading, and I'll come back with another video about writing. So the process here is that we open a stream. And so you might think, okay, well, what's a stream? You can think of that as just a sequence of characters or a sequence of bytes. And in this class, we're really going to be dealing with text files. And so we'll be working with character streams, but the same process works if I were just reading bytes. And you might think, well, when would I do that? If you think about reading in an image, you could read that in byte by byte. And so that would be opening a byte stream versus opening up a character stream. So you have different classes in the JDK that'll deal with that. And the concept is really the same. So once we understand working with a text file, we can apply these same concepts across anything that we want to read. So we open up that stream, so kind of make a connection to this thing that we want to read, and you can imagine a file sitting somewhere that we want to read with a sequence of characters in it. And so we open that up, we connect to it, and while there's more information, so you can kind of imagine reading one character at a time. So if this were my file, just this simple line here, my reader is going to read the W, and then, okay, there's more, right? So while there's more information, then the H, and then the I, etc. So we'll have some sort of loop here that we need to code. So while there's more information, read that next thing, that next character, if you really looked at this at the basics. And then when we're done, when there isn't any more information, we're going to close things up. So we want to make sure that we kind of, you can think of this as disconnecting from that file or making sure that we close it using our classes so that we don't leave a connection kind of open to that thing. Same ideas with writing, but again, we'll come back to that. And so there's a whole bunch of classes in the JDK that allow us to do this kind of work, and that's the java.io package. And we'll jump out to the JDK documentation in a little bit and take a look at those. But essentially what that package of classes has in it is a collection of what we call stream classes. Now I mentioned up above that a stream is a sequence of characters. We also hear streams in terms of a class of classes or a group of classes that know how to read data from a particular source in terms of an input stream. And an output stream is going to be the same thing, this set of classes that's available to write out to some destination, whether that's a file or your screen or whatever that is. So to use those classes, of course, we're going to have to do an import just like we did with our array list in first semester Java. In order to use that, we had to import java.util. Here we'll import java.io to have access to this variety of classes. All right, so the character streams that I mentioned. So again, these are the classes that are able to read our 16-bit characters. And so there's a class hierarchy here. Reader is an abstract superclass here, so we can't actually instantiate that, but it sets up the rules for, all right, what are any of the reader type classes going to have to do? Well, they're going to need to be able to read, and they're going to need to be able to close up whatever it is that they're reading, and then there could be additional methods that get implemented there as well. And so here what we're seeing in the gray coloring here, and that may or may not show real well for you, but the char array reader, piped reader, string reader, and file reader, those are shown in gray, and those read or write from data sync. So it's just simply just reading. You can think of it that way. And the white ones, or the lighter colored ones, these add some type of processing. So buffered reader, for example, is one that we'll be using, and buffered reader adds some performance and improvements there. So you can think of, as I was showing you up above when I was kind of reading character by character here, you can think of that buffered reader as being able to read more chunks at a time. So you can imagine that reading just one character at a time is kind of slow. Buffered reader allows us to read larger chunks at a time, if you will, or just get some better performance there. So lots of different classes there. Again, what we'll really be focused on in this course is the buffered reader, again, because of the performance improvements that we get from that. So let's jump out. I'm going to come back to this little chunk, but I want to jump out to the API and just show you that java.io package. So we'll start there, and packages, of course, are listed up here. And let's just zoom in a little bit so you can see a little better here. So here we've got that java.io package, and of course just a little refresher on how the JDK documentation works in version 8. If I choose the package here, then down below I can see all of the interfaces and the classes that are part of that package. And here we can see reader. Again, that was that kind of highest level superclass, and we can see what methods are there. So we've got several, we've got close, we've got read, etc. And so then the classes, the subclasses that we're looking at can implement these. The two methods that are abstract, and this is a little bit of a review from first semester Java, are read and close. So those have to be implemented by the subclass, right? So these abstract methods, there's not really going to be code here, but we know that if we're reading something, we need to have a read method and we need to have a close method. And then there are other methods that are implemented here as well and could be, of course, overridden. And then those particular subclasses could have additional methods there as well. So that's that reader. Let's take a quick peek at, let's look at that buffered reader, for example. And the nice thing about some of the documentation here for those readers is that they provide a little snippet of sample code. So we can see how we need to instantiate a buffered reader. And you'll notice that the constructor for buffered reader takes in a file reader. And here we're chaining together that constructor. And I'll break that down in a little bit so we can see how that really comes together. But oftentimes you'll see this sort of constructor chaining happening just because it's easier to write one line than two. But as we're getting started with this, so it might look a little bit awkward. And with the writer, we'll see that we end up chaining, in fact, 3 constructors together. So we've got that example. And here in double quotes, then, of course, is the name of the file that we want to read in this case. So buffered reader kind of wraps up that file reader to give us some better performance there. All right, and lots of different methods here, so keep in mind that this is kind of your first resource for learning more about these classes that we're going to be using, what methods are available. We've got read, we can read a line of text, as I mentioned, just a little bit better performance. The ready method tests whether the stream is ready to be read, so have we connected to it, do we have access, is it set to go, is there some stuff there to be read, and so we'll see that being used in the code demo as well. So let's go ahead and hop back into the lecture notes here. And so here is that constructor that I was talking about. Well, here's the constructor that I pointed out with the chained or nested constructors. If we break that down into 2 lines, because essentially what we're doing here is creating a new file reader and we're giving that to the buffered reader constructor. Here's what that looks like if we break that out into 2 lines, which might be a bit easier to look at here. So here I have a file reader as the type. My object reference variable is reader. And here in the constructor, I'm passing along the name of the file that I want to read. And this is creating a file reader for me. And that would work fine if I want to read a little bit more slowly or not as efficiently, but I want to be efficient about this, so I'm going to use the buffered reader. So when I'm instantiating that buffered reader object, I give it the reader from up above. So essentially that file reader knows how to find that file, how to connect to it, how to start reading character by character, and then the buffered reader kind of uses that and adds some performance enhancement. So that's what's going on here. And then here is that nested constructor. So here we have a note about an issue, and we start now getting into exception handling. And in the demo, I'm going to walk through this so we can kind of see these exceptions, or the requirement for handling these exceptions as we're writing our code, and see how the compiler kind of helps us determine how to handle that. We can also look at the Java API or the Java doc to see, okay, what am I going to have to handle when I'm calling a particular method or calling a particular constructor. So let's head back into the JDK and look at the constructor for file reader. So in the file reader, we'll head back to java.io just to kind of make this a little bit easier to find. And then here is our file reader. And if we scroll down and take a look at the file reader constructor, and specifically this one because we're just passing in a string file name, let's pop that guy open, and we'll see that that particular constructor throws an exception, a file not found exception. So it's at the point where we're constructing that file reader, and file reader is trying to find that file wherever it is, right, on disk, and in our case here, and it's going to be right on our local computer in our projects directory is the first file that we're going to try to read in the demo. So file reader is going to try to do that when we construct that object. And if that file's not there, that's a problem, obviously. And so what happens is that constructor will throw then a file not found exception if the file's not found. And so with exception handling, we need to then handle that. So something can go wrong when I'm trying to essentially connect to that file. It may not be there. So we know from the JDK that there's a possibility of having this file not found exception thrown. And essentially, that means there can be some kind of error, and this is a specific type. So exception is a class in the JDK. File not found exception is a specific subclass of that, and we can see that here. So here's java.lang exception. IO exception is a subclass of that, and then file not found exception is a subclass yet of IO exception. So there's a little review of subclasses here too. And so the developer who essentially wrote this file reader class knew there can be a problem, and whoever uses this file reader class is going to have to handle that. So whether it's giving the user a warrant message that says, hey, I couldn't find that file, essentially this just provides a notification that something happened, and then as a developer we need to decide what to do when that happens, and that's the exception handling part. How do we handle the exception when it happens? So let's head back here into how we're going to handle those exceptions. And so what we'll do is surround that risky code where something can go wrong, and in this case that's that constructor of the file reader, with a try and then a catch block. So try to do this stuff, and if something goes wrong, then I can catch those exceptions. And you'll see that here I'm catching that file not found exception. There are additional exceptions that could happen. There could be an IO exception, and then we always want to just catch sort of the general exception. So if something happens that doesn't fall into one of these two categories, then this is sort of the catch-all, if you will. And then the last piece of sort of our traditional exception handling is to have a finally clause. So whether things work okay or there were exceptions, we'll always do whatever's in the finally clause. And in that case, that is closing up that reader, okay? And you'll see there's yet another try catch in here because something could go wrong as I'm trying to close that file. Maybe it got deleted, so I was reading it just fine, and then it comes time to close it and somebody else removed it, or something like that. So we again will have to have more exception handling as we're doing that. So that is kind of an introduction to exception handling. Let's continue back with a bit of the reading. So if you remember back up above here, we talked about opening a stream. while there's more information, read the information and close the stream. So far what we've done is open that stream and we saw closing the stream. Now how do we actually do the reading? How do we start pulling stuff out of that particular file? And so here is that while loop that I mentioned earlier. And here we've got a call to that ready method on our buffered reader. And what that's doing is seeing, okay, is there more data to read? And have I connected the file? Is there data there to read? And so we do use this ready method. It returns a Boolean. So as long as we're connected, there's more stuff to read, then I can start reading line by line. And if you remember back to when we took a quick peek at that JDK, the JDK Java doc for the buffered reader, there was a method on their read line. And so that's going to return to us a string. So on our buffered reader, in this case, that's the object reference variables input reader, call read line, and that's going to return to us a single line of the file that we're reading. And so putting that all together, here's the code that we end up getting here. So we're calling the constructor, opening up, making a connection to that file, opening the file, creating a placeholder for each line that we read, reading in that line. And in this case, we're not doing anything with it. So there's a comment here about, okay, process it somehow. Maybe we just dump it out to the console to show that we're getting through the data, and that's likely what I'll do in the demo. And then, of course, our exception handling that we talked about. So this really gives us a full class or method that will open a file, start reading it line by line, and then close that file when we're finished. All right, so that's all the information you technically need for Lab 4. If you want to go ahead and jump into that lab and start practicing with that, there are tests there, so you're going to be doing, making sure that the tests pass. However, you don't have to follow the test-driven development here if you don't want to. So we are giving you some steps in terms of how to complete the lab and what methods you need and that kind of thing. But again, there still are tests. So you could choose to do test-driven development first, but providing you with the steps at least gives you an idea of what you're going to be building, which is essentially an application that allows the user to pass in the name of the file they want to read and then read that file in and output each line to the console. So that's the idea behind this particular lab. And you'll notice that this kind of builds on Lab 3, where we were prompting the user for some information at the command line. So please enter one argument at the command line. You're going to see this kind of theme where we keep building and building on these labs until we get to the project, and then everything kind of comes together. All right, so that is our big long overview of input, reading files, and exception handling. We'll see you in the next video, which will be a demo.